Hey guys, welcome back! Schwarzenegger movies were my thing back in the 80s and 90s, and Total Recall is one of my favorites ever! The home computer video game based on it suffered quite a harsh development process, and recently the rolling demo of the original scrapped ZX Spectrum version was retrieved and made playable for us to try. Let's take a look! After RoboCop, Paul Verhoeven returned 3 years later with another bone-crushing and sci-fi thriller based on a short story by Philip K. Dick, first published in April of 1966 in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. In Total Recall, a constellation of Hollywood's finest stars were hired to propel Verhoeven's masterpiece beyond the infinite. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sharon Stone, Michael Ironside, Rachel Ticotin and Ronnie Cox were just a few that helped to bring Dick's story to the big screen. Obviously, that Ocean Software would grab the license to develop the home computer versions of Total Recall for the Amiga, Atari ST, Commodore 64, Amstrad CPC and the ZX Spectrum that would place it right into second place in UK video game charts. A completely distinct NES port was also developed by Interplay, that were hired by Acclaim and more focused in the original story than on the movie in which it was based. It was released in August of 1990, right after the movie's premiere, and Nintendo Power even held a contest in where the first prize would be a Martian police uniform and a trip to Hollywood, with the chance to meet Schwarzenegger himself. Later, the magazine admitted that it was their worst promotion ever, cause the winner of the contest only had the chance of a quick handshake more than a year after the promotion ended. All over the internet, gamers are unanimous, stating that this is one of the worst games on the system and one of the worst ever made. And I can only agree with those judgments. It's a complete disrespect towards the amazing movie in which it was supposed to be based. As told in many of my videos, Ocean Software was one of the greatest and most respected British software houses, and Simon Butler, one of its finest artists, with renowned work on the graphics for the ZX Spectrum version of the Never-Ending Story and for designing the C64 version of Platoon. In late 80s, Simon and other colleagues were foreseeing the end of the 8-bit era and were excited to move forward and grab the 16-bit technology with, like Portuguese people would say, nails and teeth. So in one of those weekly downstairs meetings, he politely formulated the question of when was Ocean moving onto the 16-bit machines? The answer was Ocean will not be developing 16-bit titles. Simon Butler resigned that same day. After he received that answer, he went to work at another studio to develop 16-bit titles. At the moment of his resignation, he was working on the sprites for the C64 version of RoboCop. Then Stephen Thompson stepped into the vacancy and ended up finishing and further develop all the graphics for the amazing C64 RoboCop game that we all know. So as said, after Ocean, Simon Butler went on working for a team that shortly after ran into financial problems and he found himself looking for work once again. It was during this period that he applied for a position at an unknown company in Manchester by the name Active Minds. They were new to the industry with only 2 titles in the works, Gaza 2 and Total Recall. Simon realized on day 1 that the product was doomed. The lead artist was not in the office when Simon started at Active Minds, so he had 2 days to look at his design document, which was one of the worst things he had ever read. Simon also checked out the existing graphics and they were terrible also, so he went to the coding department Active Minds has been working on the game for at least 2 months and had produced absolutely nothing. Something was wrong. The boss of the company thought things were proceeding fantastically and was very proud of his team. Even the producer from Ocean was strangely proud of the progress. It was when Simon Butler realized that the team did not know what they were doing, and the producer was reporting complete lies back to Gary Bracey at Ocean by saying that the game was amazing and everything was going smoothly. The lead artist finally came into the office the next week, and after a quick chat with him, Simon realized he was a complete idiot and that he was taking advantage of a boss who knew nothing about game development. He was getting paid and giving nothing in return. By the way, he was also smoking dubious things in the office and in plain sight. So because of this, he was told to leave, and if he didn't, Simon was quite prepared to call the police and report him for possession of illegal drugs and have him arrested on the spot. So he left. Simon Butler became lead artist the next day and immediately told the coding team that they could leave anytime they wanted if they didn't like the situation. The days of sitting around and doing nothing were over. It was time to really get their hands dirty and earn their salaries. Simon contacted Mark R. Jones that worked on the ZX Spectrum version that became the demo bundled with Spanish Micro Obi issue 204. Things were still not making sufficient progress. Their boss was getting in the way and the Ocean producer was making life very difficult. It was when Simon Butler attempted to explain matters to his boss at Active Minds. As Simon stated, he too was an idiot and he did not understand how much trouble he was in if this title was not completed. Simon Butler ended up resigning and immediately ran into the office of Ocean Software, where he met with Gary Bracey, informing him of the situation, but Gary told Simon that he was wrong. Ocean's producer had been giving Gary weekly updates and ensured him that the project was on schedule and looking great. Simon Butler insisted that the producer was a liar and looking to get Gary Bracey into trouble and possibly even get his job when Total Recall was not completed. Gary again said that Simon was mistaken, but even so, asked him to wait in his office while he went across to Active Minds to check himself the progress of the game. An hour later, Gary returned looking very ill and worried and asked Simon what he could do to rescue the game. Simon answered that if he allowed him to choose from Ocean coders and artists, he could promise that the game would be completed. One last condition was, if he succeeded, he would like to return to Ocean as a full-time employee. If he failed, Gary could happily escort him out of the building and never lay his eyes on him. A lot of effort was put into saving this original concept for both the 16 and 8-bit versions of Total Recall, but Ocean ended up realizing that it was going to miss completely the Christmas rush and their hopes of having a #1 hit for that highly lucrative period, so they've ordered for the CPC and ZX Spectrum versions to be brought in-house and be developed from scratch. And the team had only 2 weeks to pull it off, now aiming for a release alongside the VHS tape.
2 weeks!
And I can say that they indeed pulled that one off. They completed all 3 8-bit versions for the Christmas release. The 16-bit versions were completed after Christmas. Simon Butler and his team worked over the Christmas period, and after 3.5 weeks of hard work, gave the #1 hit that Ocean wanted for that holiday season. A bit late, I know, but ended up receiving praise all over the press, and by May of '91 reached the #2 on British charts. A few journalists even stated in their respective reviews that the Amstrad CPC and ZX Spectrum versions of Total Recall they received were totally different from the ones they previewed a few months before. Spanish Micro Obi, totally dedicated to the ZX Spectrum, was the only magazine to bundle a rolling demo of version 1 of Total Recall on cover tape 29 from issue 204, published in November of 1990. Inside we can read a full review, not a preview, a review of that version, and I can't simply understand how they could publish a full review of a broken and unfinished game. Recently, 27 years later, that same demo was hacked by Adrian Singh, also known as Mr. Poke from Sinclair User Magazine, and this now playable demo lets players access areas and items that were hidden in the rolling demo. It's obviously incomplete, but it's definitely something that European home computer enthusiasts from the 80s and early 90s will recall with nostalgia. Back to the final ZX Spectrum and Amstrad CPC versions that were made in 3.5 weeks, received, as said, praise from all over the place. Gamers, fans, magazine reviewers, everyone was unanimous in considering these 8-bit brand new and completely different versions of Total Recall way better than the C64 ports and even the original 16-bit Amiga and ST games developed by Active Minds. It's really awesome to recall so many years later these little stories behind the development of certain titles from the 8 and 16-bit era, and even uncover certain mysteries, and in this particular case make the ZX Spectrum rolling demo of Total Recall totally playable. By that time, things were starting to change. The advent of the 16-bit technology and the need of releasing the game simultaneously with the premiere of the movie was starting to frighten a lot of people dedicated almost exclusively to that side of the business. Games needed to be planned in advance, and way more people had to be hired to meet all those deadlines. So guys, this wraps up yet another amazing story from the early 90s, and if you've enjoyed this episode of It's a Pixel Thing, please like, share, subscribe and leave a comment that I will most certainly answer it. In the meanwhile, feel free to check my latest videos and all my other content available on my channel. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next episode.